Welcome everyone to the whatever number 15th, I think, edition of our At Home, and I'm very excited to have our guests here today. We have a slight Scotland special, although I think some of the content we're talking about isn't strictly Scottish, and one of our speakers is not strictly in Scotland, but it was arranged to be a panel discussing some of this material. So before we get going here, I'm just going to go ahead and mute everyone just in case we get some extra noises. So for our speakers, you'll need to unmute yourselves when your time comes along. Today we've got a little bit of a slightly different format, and that our first talk is going to be a sort of tag team effort by two speakers. Then we have a second talk, and then we have our museum 5 minutes. So just some of the basic etiquette for our at-homes. We do ask that you keep yourself muted during your talks. You're welcome to have your video on. It's always quite nice to see you. But if your connection is poor and you're finding things stuttering or going on, you might find that actually turning your video off will help with your own bandwidth. We're going to have time for chat and discussion questions after each talk. So do please feel free to go ahead and put your questions into the chat, even as they pop up in your mind during the talk. And our question master today is Anna, and Anna will be fielding those. So we'll have a few minutes for questions after each of our talks, and then we'll probably have some time for some discussion at the end as well. Especially if you have some more longer or more complex questions. And then you're also welcome to email us. We'll put our contact information in the chat. Some of you are probably already in our groups, in our listserv group. That's how you hear about us. And yeah, so I think that's all of the things that I need to be saying. Without further ado, then we can get going. So our first talk today, as I said, is going to be a little bit of a team effort. So I'm just going to tell you who both of our speakers are. We are going to have Dr. Emily Taylor, who is the Assistant Curator of European Decorative Arts at National Museum of Scotland, and she's the Secretary and Trustee of the Association of Dress Historians, and she's doing a fantastic job. So those of you in that are probably seeing Emily's name quite a lot right these days, which we love. Emily's research focuses on National Museum of Scotland's historic fashion collection around material cultures of Euro-centric dress and textiles circa 1700 to 1900. Her recent work has looked at gendered making practices, men's fashion in museums, and global contexts of 18th century garments. Her overall interest is in how past sartorial practices have reflected their cultural landscape and shaped value systems. And alongside Emily today is Dr. Ben Wild, who is a senior lecturer in fashion cultures with Manchester Fashion Institute at Manchester Metropolitan University. Ben is a cultural historian whose research and teaches focus on themes of identity and marginality in their expression through art and dress. So I'm going to put both their Twitter and Instagram handles in the chat in case you want to do some social media while you're here. But with that, I think Emily is going to start us off first. So please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Get my PowerPoint up. So today we're going to be thinking about dressing the cultural imaginary, who's Gypsy. And before I start the garments that I'm going to be talking about, I'd just like to say that quite a few of the themes and ideas that I'm presenting are drawn from talks I've heard by Salma Ahmed Kaula and Nada Quresh in the last 6 months. So please do check out their research if you're interested in more of the kind of North African themes that I'm going to be talking about. So today we'll be exploring the cultural imaginary of one collector, considering how it reflects generational values, social education, and as this collector's items are now in National Museum Scotland, raises questions around historical canon and longevity. So the collector of the costume is Charles William Stewart, and he was a collector from around the 1950s and donated his whole collection to National Museum of Scotland in 1977. He was a child of a colonial family, born in the Philippines and sent back to Britain for his schooling. Although not necessarily cash rich, he was a member of the kind of comfortably off landed elite. So Charles's earliest memories are of shop windows and dressing up. And the meaning he attached to clothing was both imaginative romance and one of anthropological curiosity. So this ancient Greek fancy dress costume of his was photographed in several aspects, actually, and it's now part of the museum collection. Through costume, Charles seems to have experienced the synthesis of his imaginary worlds with his physical worlds. Charles became an illustrator and costume designer, and these are quite important factors as I explore a few items from his collection and the influences and experiences that had created his cultural imaginary. So within his costume collection is quite well known for having a large group of fancy and theatrical dress in it. And within that, there are at least 7 outfits which he has described as gypsy. And by using these inverted commas on the labels, so these are labels that he's written about his collection, he's demonstrating that these are not real. They are called gypsy, but are imaginary costume. They're not authentic. They're something narrative. So the gypsy dresses in his collection nearly all date to the last few decades of the 19th century. And they all share characteristics such as a waist sash, metal discs or buttons, a small jacket or a toque hat, or a bodice that mimics a jacket, and striped skirts. And these 2 items are made in Paris in Newport, UK, which we know because of the labels in them. And one of them has been described as a Spanish lady outfit, but I've included it here because we'll see a little bit later that this became conflated with gypsy later on. And I should probably say that this term of gypsy isn't just something that Charles Stewart invented. It would have been understood by all of his contemporaries as well. And what brought me to start thinking about this collection was that I understood what he was talking about, but at the same time, I didn't really understand why. And I had to start asking myself, what is a gypsy? What are we talking about? Because it isn't the kind of ethnic group gypsy. So 2 social factors that seem to be pretty critical around when these costumes were made are those of the international exhibitions and the world's fairs, which were in Western Europe and the US at this time. And these brought not only mass spectacle, but direct contact with people and performers who were introduced in these exhibitions as exhibits. And they were being brought directly from countries that were experiencing imperial and colonial aggression at that time. And then also there's the Imperial Expansion, as we can see from this idealized depiction of General Gordon's last stand. This was intertwined with the kind of romantic cultural imaginings of North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. And it was Salma Ahmed Kaula who brought my attention to the fact that colonial postcards were being deliberately produced to entice largely male settlers to French Africa. And within these postcards are images of musicians and professional dancers, or women that posed as them. So the social communities of these dancers I won't attempt to describe. I'm not an expert and it is quite complex. But I will say that they danced fully clothed and they were paid performers. And some of the language around them suggests that these performers were known within their local communities as strong, independent characters. But to a colonial man, they were women on public streets and therefore synonymous with availability, if not prostitution. So there's the added complication of long associations with licentiousness and Orientalism. And these street performers danced with castanets and tambourines. They wore anklets and short bodices. So their dress is clearly part of the inspiration behind the 19th century gypsy dress outfits that Charles Stewart acquired. And they are part of artists' depictions that are intended to transport you to a new and different world. The world of Orientalist ancient Mediterranean, where time might stand still and worldly cares can be neglected. A world where waist sashes and striped skirts were worn by porcelain women in Greek poses, which is quite a long way from working performance groups who were traveling the globe and yet borrowing their cultural signifiers. So these groups of Gwazi dancers were photographed as part of their tours in the Exposition Universelle, and I think the group on the right-hand side was the Chicago World's Fair. And then mixing them up so that they become Spanish tambourine girls half a century later, instead of Indo-Arabic or Arabic African. So the imperial historical romance is directly connected to the political landscape. And Holman Hunt might have first visited the Levant in the mid-19th century, but he painted this bride only 2 years after Britain had taken occupation of Egypt. And Alma Tadema engages with the mass historical spectacle, where pale-skinned people are transcendent, and I might add, not in the slightest bit sunburnt. And Alma Tadema's painting was created at a time of pageant fever in Britain, where historical acting out is championed as a way to connect communities to their origin identities, firming up their sense of a noble historic past, which might reach back to Anglo-Saxon times or even earlier. So the historical spectacle, although supposed to be set in the Greco-Roman world, that has these associations with the kind of origins of white civilization, is at the turn of the 19th century intermixed with the Orient, such as with roses, which are synonymous with Persia. And these themes of a beautiful, grand and imaginary history appealed hugely to Charles Stewart and resulted in his collecting costume, which was overlooked by others at the time, such as this part of an ancient Egyptian costume headdress. So it's important to remember that Charles was an illustrator. He studied at Byam School of Arts, attended ballet classes, and he was an avid reader of historical fiction. So he would have been exposed to 19th century arts, as well as living in a social world where colonial material culture was normalized. Stewart chased the romantic and the make-believe, and we know he loved a big screen epic. From fancy and theatrical wear that he purchased in Scottish antique stores and London second-hand markets, his taste progressed. And particularly after a holiday in Greece, he became avidly interested in Greek costume. What started as a fascination with a culture he was imagining through its dress and depictions, he began to collect in earnest in his later buying years. And he was trying to accurately assemble regional costumes whilst roaming around, not physically, but in his collecting habits, from Turkey to Greece, Albania, Macedonia, and Serbia in his quest, very much like a kind of Byronic hero. So even when attempting ethnographic accuracy, we can see that Stewart was still entranced by what Adam Grexey has described as the diaphanous mystique of Orientalism. And I'll leave you with this thought from Grexey that at the end of the 19th century, this degree of absorption into popular perception lays the foundation stone for Orientalist fashion in the next century, where it occupies two main domains: adoption and absorption on the one hand, and inflection and inspiration on the other. Thank you. Okay.
Ben, you'll need to unmute. Sorry.
Okay, so hopefully you can see the image and text on your screen. Emily, thank you. What I want to do is develop some of the points and themes that Emily was talking about, particularly the idea of narrative, but also I think the point that Emily was making about synthesis, that interplay, that tension perhaps between the imaginary and the real, the fact and the fantasy. So I want to start with Charles Stewart, whom you see here on the left of your screens. But I want to think a little bit more over the next few minutes about motivations. What is sort of some of the ideas, what are some of the reasons for those images and garments that Emily has presented to us? And I suppose in the spirit perhaps of that quote from Gypsy, think about Orientalism as it's sort of manifesting itself in the 19th century, but also to roam wider chronologically into the 20th century as well, and in so doing move a little bit beyond fancy dress costume and think about popular culture more broadly. So I want to start with two quotes. The first that you can see on your screen, and this is a quote from a text that Charles Stewart wrote, a little publication called The Holy Greed, that was written as he's presenting his collection of costumes to the National Museum of Scotland. And I suppose in a sense it serves as a biography of the collection, a sort of rationale as to how it's been assembled. And in so doing, acting as something of an autobiography for him as well. So I want to read it and tease out some words that I think are important. Perhaps the strongest impulse for amassing this collection of costume lay in a romantic and nostalgic interest in the past. Clothes, through their shape, color, ornament, and design, no less than through their close physical association with those who wore them, seemed to me to evoke the past more vividly than anything else. The desire to rescue and restore these fragile and often beautiful things, strangely less perishable than their mortal owners, made me feel it was almost a duty to strain my resources to the utmost to ensure their preservation wherever I could. There's a lot of, I think, ideas to digest within here, and I just want to sort of tease out some words, as I said, as we're beginning to think about that the why as to what's going on here, but that interplay, even tension between fact and fiction. And so we start off with Charles Stewart talking about an impulse. So something that is almost non-self-conscious, something that is maybe perhaps emotional. And that's picked up in these phrases here about the romance and the nostalgia. But we might, I suppose, ask ourselves and ask of Stewart, whose romance and whose nostalgia? And if we look at that image of Stewart on the left, here he is around 1925 in that Greek costume, again with the inverted commas. If we think about what he's wearing, if we think about his pose, his relationship vis-a-vis that sort of pseudo Greek statue, it's interesting to reflect that it's not actually until 1976 that Stewart does indeed go to Greece. So in terms of a nostalgia, what is this a nostalgia of? And I think that inquiry is borne out as he goes on to focus on the materiality of the costumes, their shape, their color and ornament and design, which he suggests evokes the past. But again, as he's perhaps making clear, and as Emily did too in her talk, this is not a past that he has directly experienced. It is a past that he is willing into reality. It's a past that he is imagining. And I think that that's borne out most readily with this idea where he suggests that the materiality of the garments that he's collecting are strangely less perishable than their mortal owners. So to me, I think suggesting that he's maybe not interested in the people who are wearing these costumes directly, not their lived experiences or what perhaps their cultures represent or meant. What he's more interested in is what these cultures mean to him in the construction of narratives that make sense to him. And the many ideas that come through in this paragraph, by the end, we've come to this idea of a duty to collect, to assemble these costumes in some form of narrative sequence. And that's quite a move. We start with an impulse, something that's quite emotional and, as I said, non-self-conscious, to then something that is a duty. But again, to be thinking about who is this duty for, and who are these narratives being constructed for, if we're not primarily interested in the first instance in their initial wearers. I think for me in this, there's a wider comment and point about fancy dress costume more broadly. We often tend to trivialize it, to marginalize it, both within popular culture then as now, but also within academia. And possibly we tend to do that because the nature of these costumes are not particularly sophisticated, perhaps, in their methods of construction. They are often worn for a very short period of time, and they're often worn at times when people are not particularly reflective, usually when they're sort of lost in the moment at a party. But I want to suggest through the remarks that I make that that's often perhaps why fancy dress is so important, because it means that it can respond very immediately, very directly to what a person or group of people might be feeling at the time. And I suppose, to use a rather horrid phrase, tap into the zeitgeist. And so if that's one sort of quote to get us going and to link very much to Emily's ideas, another quote that I want to share, and one, frankly, that I share all the time when I'm talking about fancy dress costume, because I think it describes the phenomenon quite well, is this from Barbara Babcock. The socially peripheral is often symbolically central. And here I am suggesting that, I suppose, fancy dress costume by its nature and performance is socially peripheral. The collection that Charles Stewart is amassing is socially peripheral, but symbolically central. And if we ignore or minimize inversion and other forms of cultural negation, we often fail to understand the dynamics of social process generally. So whilst those examples that we've looked at, that Emily shared with us, might on some level seem exceptional to us in the 21st century, maybe unsettling, they are, I think, nonetheless telling us something quite important, quite central about the values of Charles Stewart in the first instance, but more broadly, that the people that are collecting, amassing, wearing, performing in these garments. And of course, although we can talk about Charles Stewart, we're all aware that this construction of narratives through costume or through clothing has been going on long before, and indeed long since. And I want to sort of make that point and reflect a little bit more about Emily's comments on Orientalism by talking about this image, this portrait of William Fielding, 1st Earl Denbigh, from around 1633, that you may have seen in the collection of the National Gallery in London. To situate this in its context, so if this is completed in 1633, in the 3 or so years prior to this, Fielding has been on a tour of what at the time probably would have been referred to as Persia. So this is a portrait that immortalizes that trip. And if we look at the portrait, we can see Fielding, not surprisingly, dominating. To his left, a little boy who is with his right hand gesturing up into the tree, where we can see a parrot. Fielding, I think, is an interesting individual. He was responsible for the wardrobe of King Charles I, who's on the throne of England at the time. So very interested in the role that costume, that clothing has in the projection of identity and authority. Fielding's wife, of course, is custodian of the Queen's jewels, Henrietta Maria. So both aware, as I said, of that spectacle to which Emily alluded to of power. But I think what's interesting here in this portrait is Fielding almost in a sense bringing his knowledge of the clothing that he's seen whilst he's been on his travels with, of course, the clothing that he will be familiar with from England and more specifically the royal court, because what he's wearing here is a sort of mashup. It's a sort of intermingling of both sort of the fact and the sort of the fantasy of costume and clothing as he would have understood it, because we're looking here at very much a hybrid garment. And it's a really interesting garment, because if we think about the situation in England as it evolved after the Civil War and with the accession of Charles II in 1666, it's of course on the 7th of October 1666 that Charles II initiates this sort of great clothing reform where almost overnight, according to Samuel Pepys' diary, he does away with the doublet and the breeches that sort of characterized the dress of his father's court, and introduces a much starker, much more restrained long coat with sort of embryonic trousers. And many commentators, many historians have said that this is a sort of proto three-piece suit. Well, one of the inspirations, there are lots of origin stories for this sartorial innovation in 1666, but one of the origin stories is to suggest that what you see Fielding wearing here is an inspiration. But I think for our purposes, and linking back, I suppose, to that construction of narratives, I show it to you because for me, there are certain portraits that we can look at that show that sort of that moment of fashions in flux, moments of sartorial change, where the inspiration from different cultures in this instance are apparent. What of course we also see here going on with this sort of appropriation and adaptation, this restructuring of dress that Fielding is engaged with, is a manifestation, an example of Orientalism that Emily spoke to. So when we think of Orientalism, of course, we're thinking of the work primarily of Edward Said. And I just sort of paraphrase here from something I'm writing, two sections from Said's work, which you can read for yourselves. But I think in the first paragraph for me, and that idea that Emily started with about narratives. So here, this idea that Orientalism is a cultural enterprise, but it's about restructuring. It's about reinterpreting narratives that suit ourselves. And again, thinking about the language that Charles Stewart is using in his collection of dress, constructing, restructuring narratives that sort of suit a worldview that is comforting to himself. And then in the second paragraph here, this idea that Orientalism then becomes, as Said says, a system of knowledge about the Orient. And as Emily said, if we're thinking about depictions of so-called gypsies, that does merge with depictions of the Orient as well. But this idea that becomes then an accepted grid for the filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness. So it's how the West chooses to, wants to understand, wants to see the Orient. So what Charles Stewart, I suppose, is doing in microcosm within his collection, we can perhaps see more broadly going on in this image that is earlier, but also in images that are later, which I now want to move on to. So a bit of a chronological jump, but picking up on something that does very much link to Charles Stewart. Emily suggested that a big inspiration for Stewart in his collecting was literature and contemporary drama. He also, in his little pamphlet explaining the genesis of collection, talks about film. And I think it's quite interesting as we sort of seek to map moments in popular culture where depictions of an Orientalism, as Edward Said refers to here, when they become apparent or when they spike, that often coincides with moments where the West is grappling in some way with political crises in that part of the world. And Emily alluded to that for the 19th century, but I want to take this story through into the 1950s.
Ben?
Yeah.
So sorry, we're running quite a bit over time, starting to get over time. So do you have a quick little wrap? Because we've got some questions coming in too. We want to make sure we have a little moment. So
sure, I will conclude then with one example. And there's an example from the 1950s. It is of the Suez Canal crisis. So this is an image that would have appeared in a British journal, and would have been sort of read by or viewed by people within Britain. To identify the kind of lead figures here, we have the President of Egypt and the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden. What I think is interesting here, though, is the depiction of these figures in an interpretation of the tale of Salome, where Nasser becomes the female Salome, who of course wanted the head of John the Baptist, which becomes the beleaguered Prime Minister here, Anthony Eden. And I think in this presentation of the drapes that Nasser is surrounded by, the fabric that he's leaning against, the way that he's holding his body, looking at his nails, there's a feminized portrayal, which matches very much how the West depicted the Orient in lots and lots of paintings throughout Western history, but always in these paintings of this scene from the Tale of Salome, interpreting the Orient, interpreting the East through a Western lens, with Western dress, with Western costume, with, of course, Western ideas and ideals. And it's interesting, I think, to reflect that carries through very much into the 1950s with film. The year before this sketch was created, and at the time that the Suez Canal crisis is kicking off, we have in 1955, The Son of Sinbad being released. And think about the portrayal of these women, again, reclining, luxuriating, very similar in some ways to the presentation here of Nasser, but depicting the Orient in a way that suits the West. Where in 1955, it's in 1953 that the bikini becomes popularized. And again, as Emily said of the artwork that she showed, a profusion of white people. Again, the caption of the wickedness of women. The year later, in 1958, the year after the cartoon on the left, again, another depiction of the Orient with these sort of beasts and demons, and again, white people coming in to sort of to rescue. These construction of narratives, on the one hand, seeming quite different, perhaps, to Charles Stewart, but I think through using and adapting sort of popular culture, constructing narratives that enable them to make sense of their world and portray a narrative that comforts themselves. So it is about nostalgia, as Charles Stewart suggested, but a nostalgia that is again, quite personal, quite sort of self-referential, and in some ways quite perhaps disturbing, not perhaps as innocent as we might suppose. I'll stop there then, but we can sort of carry on some of those thoughts, I hope, in the questions afterwards.
Thank you so much, Ben and Emily. It's absolutely fascinating, and I'm sorry that we don't have more time to get into detail, because I know that this is a really rich topic for all of us, and it's always fun for us to get into the realm of comparisons that kind of stretch before and after the 19th century as our focus. Could we maybe do one quick question, Anna, because I think our time is quite tight now.
Yeah, okay.
So pick one if we can.
So there's quite a few come in. Let's have a little scroll through. Yeah.
I vote for Courtney's.
Okay, let me scroll down.
The last one.
Okay. So this is from Courtney. If there's time, I'd like to hear both speakers' thoughts on where Western concepts of fashion enter into the equation of changing perceptions of non-Western dress, especially during the 19th century, and for the collector as well, who was looking back from the 20th century. Okay, so this is a nature of a distillation of Western concepts fitting into perceptions of non-Western dress? It's a kind of catch-all broad question.
Yeah, can you do that in like a minute or two each?
Yeah, just a minute.
Kind of hooks into Veronica's questions too about the concepts of the gypsy and the complications. I think there have been some really rich questions around that, so we can maybe answer them in the chat or come back at the end too. Emily, do you want, or Ben?
I guess I'm kind of a little bit thrown here because I'm talking about fancy dress, which isn't fashion. I'm talking about people performing a specific character at specific times. So yes, there's like, crossovers with fashion, but I haven't. Yeah, Robin, you're the expert on late 19th century fashion. You can probably answer this a lot better than me.
I'm not on the scene today. Well, you know what? Hannah actually, if I could, earlier had asked about the classification of costumes and fancy dress as well, and how these things get mixed up. So there's something, I think, picking apart a little bit of that in that too. I don't know. Hannah had asked in the middle of the question, do you think that Charles Stewart understood these costumes as constructed idealized fantasy or linked with a white notion of the Orient?
I mean, yes. He knew what he was collecting. He knew it was fancy dress and theatrical, and that's what he was interested in. And he knew the difference between what he was collecting as fancy and theatrical and what was good. He was a really early member of the Costume Society in its first, I think he joined in its first kind of 5 years. And that really helped him. I think it was after he joined the Costume Society that he started writing all these labels for his collection. So he sometimes is a little bit inaccurate, but that's more to do with what knowledge was available about dress history at that time. But what he was doing was really pinpointing it quite well. So I think when I was thinking about the kind of Greek and him straying into ethnographic collection, I think for me it's quite interesting that he's still being directed by quite romantic notions, but he knows that what he's trying to do is be quite accurate to, I suppose, what you might broadly call folk costume or regional dress. A lot of his collection also does contain quite a lot of garments that are a little bit, we're not quite sure if it's fancy and theatrical or if it was actually worn as a dress. So there's definitely lots of grey areas where this is all kind of blurring together. And I think this is just part and parcel of him he was a creative. So I think Veronica asked about where you can learn a bit more about him. Some of his illustrations are in the Royal Academy. They have a small collection. There's a really good bio of him that was done as an obituary in 2001 on The Independent, and that's quite easily searchable online.
I think just one thing, quickly, but I think your point, Emily, about blurring is really key, because I think in the 19th century, late 18th and 19th century, the discipline of history as we understand it has not really been kind of formed and established. So that sense that people that we would of that period describe as historians are not engaging in the craft as we would understand it and practice it today. So that idea of sort of fact and fantasy and imagination sort of merging in the sort of, so say, authoritative texts, I think is quite common. So to look for some of those divides within the collecting that Charles Stewart is doing, for example, is perhaps inappropriate. In the same way, I think the divides between perhaps sort of fashion and fancy dress, if you want to use that term, again in the 19th century, perhaps wouldn't have been as live or as urgent as they might be for us now. To slightly maybe come to Courtney's point, I think it's certainly the case that when you've got, and I think with Emily's point about the World Fair of 1881, when you've got and Eileen Ribeiro talks about this in her work, when you have sort of groups of people from different countries, different cultures, from beyond Europe coming into London, for example, that will often be the cause for a sort of a fad or a little bit of interest in people using their costume, using their dress as a form of inspiration, which could be within a theatrical context, it could be within a sort of high fashion context, it could be, often was, both at the same time. So again, some of those distinctions that we might make and want to make hard and fast divisions between, perhaps didn't exist so much at the time, perhaps.
I think that's a great point, and also a good segue to get to our next talk, which I'm so excited about. We've got Professor Elizabeth Cumming with us today, with a subject very close to my own heart. It is my own art and heart, actually, talking about pageantry up here in Scotland. Professor Elizabeth Cumming is historian of Scottish art and design and honorary professor at University of Edinburgh. She was the first keeper of the City Art Centre and later taught design history at Edinburgh College of Art. Her publications include various books, essays, catalogues in the arts and crafts movement, the colorist Dovecot Studios, the painter Sir Robin Phillipson. Her latest book on Phoebe Anna Traquair, who's one of the costume designers for the Scottish National Pageant she's going to talk about, is due to be published later this year. I can't wait. Liz's work is so important to my life. And I'm delighted that she's here, but we can't see your camera. Are you?
I stopped my video and I've tried to open it up again and it doesn't seem to be working, but you can hear me and that's the main thing. I think you can hear me.
We can hear you. It's too bad we can't see you because you're lovely. So I think what we'll do is, because of the time, we'll have Liz and then I might roll right into Becky's Museum 5 minutes and then we'll have a bunch of nice questions at the end for whoever can manage it.
That's great.
Liz, you might as well turn your video off, because just in case you're stop your video if you can, just in case you're getting some bandwidth issues.
Okay.
Right,
So
share your screen.
I'll share screen now. Let's see, here we are. Now just give me a minute and we'll get started. That should be it.
Beautiful, perfect.
Okay, well, this is going to be much more of a slideshow more than anything, to show the huge range of costumes that were provided for the Scottish National Pageant of Allegory, Myth and History. And so I'm going to talk about it really as examples of the artist's work. So I've got quite a few images that we'll just push ahead. This one you will see again shortly. The pageant was held in the grounds, or intended to be held in the grounds, of the Scottish National Exhibition that was mounted in Saughton Park in Edinburgh in May, June and July 1908. And this was an international exhibition, and in stark contrast to the pageant, which focused purely on Scottish culture. In fact, you could call it, the pageant, literally the fabrication of cultural memory of Scotland. There were, of course, by this point, we're right in the heart of pageantry culture right across Britain, with local groups, local towns presenting histories of their whole community through the ages. But this was much, much more ambitious, intending to go back to prehistory right through to the 1745, the Second Jacobite Rebellion, for inspiration. The pageant originally was to have been held not in the grounds of the exhibition, but in the grounds of Donaldson's Hospital for the Deaf, so that which has a large ground, and Donaldson's School for the Deaf, or Hospital for the Deaf, was where obviously the children, local children who had problems with hearing, lived and were taught. But it was moved quite late in the day, in early 1908, it was decided to move to the exhibition grounds. And our knowledge of the visual content of the pageant relies entirely on, or mainly on, two sources. First of all, a series of postcards which were published during the exhibition and available to everyone who visited the exhibition following the pageant. This is one example here showing the court of James I and Queen Joanna parading around there, waiting to go on parade in the exhibition, through the grounds of the exhibition. And they're in the grounds, they're photographed in the art complex, the art exhibition hall, so you can get a good view of some of the paintings that were on show, mostly by Scottish artists. And that gives you your first introduction to the type of costumes that were made. Altogether, there were over 1,000 players in this massive, massive pageant. If we look at Queen Joanna on the left, we can see in the next one, her again on the right, and this introduces the second source of the images that illustrate the costumes. And these come from an album which surfaced in Ireland 9 years ago, and which I was very lucky enabled to purchase at auction. So it's a wonderful record of some of the costumes, because you get details of fabric, the costumes, design, and there's some wonderful images altogether. So the sisters Blair were Princess Margaret and her mother Queen Joanna in the actual pageant. And those photographs were taken partly in the Edinburgh Photographic Studio of Drummond, Young and Watson. Some other photographs were taken during rehearsals in the grounds of either Collington House in Edinburgh or in the house and gardens of E.A. Walton, and we'll come to him in just a second. Now, pageantry and historical costume was, of course, nothing very new in a sense to Edinburgh, because the entrance hall of the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, which opened in 1889, was decorated a few years later by William Hull. And William Hull is to become one of a number of the designers of costumes. In fact, he designed Queen Joanna and Princess Margaret and that earlier group that we've just seen. In his decoration of the portrait gallery, he relied in part on known portraits of the past, but of course, going further back in time beyond the 17th century, further back, he relied on his imagination largely. So you can't get exact accuracy in some of these older figures. So a lot of this is completely composed by William Hull. Some of his designs were published, printed and published, as we see here on the left of the screen, in a volume of which I've only come across one example, which is in the National Library of Scotland collection. And I put in just to compare the actual costume worn and made up to these designs. So you compare the design and the actual costume on the right-hand side, and how simple some of these costumes were. And he deliberately seems to have simplified his design as much as possible, thinking about the making. But these are two other ones which were obviously within William Hull's period. He designed the costumes from the early medieval age up to the year 1700. And then there was another artist, a now forgotten artist called Graham Glenn, who designed post-1700, 1700 to 1745. And then for the second Jacobite Rising costumes of 1745, my own great-great-uncle, William Stewart Cumming, was the designer for those. And he was much more authentic in his portrayal of costume because he was a collector. And I think there are some items he collected within the National Museums of Scotland collection, but perhaps we can find out more about that a little later on. I do like the fellow on the right, Peter Mackey. I always think he was an artist in Edinburgh and a friend of Stewart Cumming's, my uncle's. And I always think he looks really wonderful. What a glorious wig that is. He's just having a great time in Drummond Young and Young's studio, posing for the cameras for posterity. But most of the pageant was in fact the brainchild of E.A. Walton, a Glasgow boy, and his wife Helen, who we see here taking part much earlier in a ball that was held in the Glasgow Art Club before the Waltons left Glasgow, moved to London. And when he came back to Scotland, he settled in Edinburgh. So he's in Edinburgh from, I think it's 1904, 1905. And when he's been in London immediately before that, he is interested in pageants. And when he comes back to Edinburgh, he and his wife, Helen, decide to organise pageants, Mary Queen of Scots pageants in 1906 and 1907. And his daughter, Cecil, is spelled Cecile, but is actually pronounced Cecil, according to the Walton family, designs the publicity for it. And it's the first pageant in aid of the Scottish Children's League of Pity, as the national pageant would be in 1908. And this fabulous dragon comes north. He's already performed, he's designed by Walter Crane, who's a friend in London of the Waltons, and E.A. Walton's brother, the designer George Walton. And Walter Crane and his dragon come north to take part, first of all, in the Queen Mary pageants of 1906, 1907, and then they perform again in 1908. This is a Scottish national pageant, the masque which was intended to complete the pageant, but in fact actually started the pageant off. And this dragon, we know from newspaper accounts, was green and had electric eyes that flashed. Well, how terrifying this is, but isn't he a fabulous dragon? And this is Walter Crane in his own costume on the left-hand side, and his wife here. And we think this is Cecil Walton as the maiden who is going to be rescued by George, alias Walter Crane. They also produced designs here, Masque of Christmas, another scene from the Masque of Christmas and St. George and the Dragon. And this is George Walton, EA's brother, the designer George, on the left-hand side. So there isn't time here to go into it, but this particular scene, performed in Edinburgh only in 1908, built on a whole Scottish borders tradition of the mummers plays, who went round houses at Christmas and the New Year in southern Scotland, but there isn't space to do that today. This is to look at costumes. So this was a pageant in aid of the Scottish Children's League of Pity, and many of the rehearsals took place in what is now Mod 2 of the Gallery of Modern Art. That was the Dean Orphanage, where these children, orphan children, lived. And they were taking part in this, and each of them was given a guardian angel as part of the Walton's Masque of the Seasons, which was a section, non-historical section of the pageant. The Masque of the Seasons has some particularly beautiful costumes associated with it. A series of 4 covering the season of winter, ice, the veil being ice, and I've just put in 2 of them, and snow with the snowflakes for the hood and the cloak of the performer here. And Cecil's elder sister Marjorie Walton played the spirit of spring, and this photograph, of course, is so Wesleyan in his design pose and the costume as well, looking back to Whistler. So the Waltons they obviously knew Whistler very well, and in London as well as other places within Britain. So interesting. This is an interesting one as well. These are all designed by the Walton family. I think Helen probably had quite a good hand in it, but Cecil Walton is said to have designed some of them or given her mother ideas for finalising the design. And that is the Dean Orphanage behind, or Mod 2, Gallery of Modern Art here in Edinburgh. The last one of the seasons, I'll just put this in before running through some of the historical costume, is Winter, and goodness, the Storm Fiend. Isn't he fabulous? Look at those shoes. And the cloak as well. Don Watson, who was another Edinburgh artist who has disappeared from sight. We don't come across his work very often as a painter, but an interesting all these unknown people. Now, the rest of the pageant was purely historical, and the Celtic group was designed by John Duncan, who was well known in Scotland, at least, as a Scottish Celtic revival artist. So both the postcards and some of the album photographs show some of his designs. again photographed in the National Art Exhibition within the Scottish National Exhibition. Yeah, this is the art gallery section. And relying a sense of authenticity where possible comes through in some of these, although many of the costumes are purely imaginative. So we know that John Duncan was looking very carefully at some of the items in the British Museum, and he's echoing this in the helmet, which is worn here by a sculptor, I think it's W.G. Stevenson here, who plays Finn. I think it's Finn or Fionn, spelt Fionn, but Finn or Fingal. Well, one of the characters within that group. And children of all ages, not just orphans from the orphanage, were taking part within this. So we have here the son of Patrick Geddes, young Arthur, and also A.F. White as another Celtic person. Now, these very, very simple sort of classical design costumes, and posed again in Drummond, Young and Watson's photographic studio within Edinburgh. Shoes are very, very important as well, all carefully designed. This one with winged heels too. So there is a link between Celticism and the classical past. And I think it's true that many of the Celtic revival artists, particularly Duncan, did see the close connection between classicism and the Celtic ideal. This is one of my own favourites. I just love this one because it's just so modern. Now, this is Edward Drummond Young. Yes, that name is familiar. He is the son of the photographer. In fact, he takes most of the photographs within, which have been saved and recorded within the album. He is the bird of death, part of the Fomores. The Fomores were Celts, Celtic, from Celtic legend, legends rather than historical characters. So this first section really did look very closely at the legends and how to interpret. It's very, very imaginative altogether. But when we come to people like, it's James Cadenhead, of course, on the left, who plays Finn, not the W.G. Stevenson I mentioned earlier. And he's a painter. Harry Gamley, the sculptor, as Cuchulainn, one of the main characters from Celtic legend. There are elements of looking to, again, British Museum collections. The Battersea shield inspires the shield being carried by James Cadenhead for this particular photograph. And that shield appears in different photographs taken in Drummond, Young and Watson's studio, carried by different characters. They all took a turn in it. But I think it's Cadenhead who actually wins and uses it when he parades in the pageant. These I think are wonderful photographs. Now we're still in the world of the imagination, and little bits of detail, I think, look that it seems to be that John Duncan is looking closely at some of the items in museum collections, sometimes quite simplified Celtic design. And he's looking also, he's aware of Celtic carvings and pattern making. As I say, there's all ages, this young fellow, we don't know who he is. The album does not identify any of the characters, and that has to be worked out gradually. And gradually, little by little, we know who they are, but not all of them by any means. Phoebe Anna Triquare, I mentioned earlier, did make some designs, and here she designed the costumes for the early church, including this embroidered cape or cope here, cope. And St. Patrick, she was originally from Ireland, so naturally she chooses particular saints that have Irish connections. Palladius went from Ireland to Scotland, and St. Patrick from Scotland to Ireland. And then I'd just like to finish with another group of costumes. These are designed in Glasgow because Glasgow had a strong pageant tradition already. In 1905, Francis Newbery, director of the art school, had headed the Mask of Science and Art to celebrate the opening of the Glasgow and West of Scotland Technical College in the autumn of 1905. And there the costumes had been designed by, among others, you have Dorothy Carlton Smythe, Decoursey Luthwaite Dewar, Annie French, Anne Macbeth, Helen Paxton Brown. And the costumes for this pageant and its partial transfer to Glasgow in October the same year, 1908, as the national pageant, are designed by Helen Paxton Brown and Jessie M. King. And so I'm just going to show you a few, first of all, from a postcard of the period available, just to give you an idea of the different type of costumes that were made and designed. I'd love to find some of these costumes, but maybe Becky can help a little later, see whether there are any in Glasgow collections or not. E.A. Taylor as Sir Galahad and Jessie herself, Jessie M. King, as the Angel of the Holy Grail, posed deliberately for Drummond Young and Watson behind this beautiful, simple net fabric to give a sense of ethereal power and spirituality. Lovely, beautiful costumes, and they're all quite different. Every artist had their own strength to play for. And the very final one I'd like to show is this one here, because this is, again, from the Arthurian legend, the dead Elaine carried on a barge. The dead Elaine was actually played by Helen Paxton Brown, one of the co-designers of the Arthurian legends section of the pageant. And there she is having a well-earned rest, being carried by the fellow players in the costume. But these are simple designs, but of Glasgow style embroideries. The simplicity, I think, is wonderful. Now, as I mentioned, some sections did transfer in October of that same year to Glasgow, where they were performed as part of a celebration at Glasgow University. And that they were photographed by Annans, and there are some fabulous photographs of some of the costumes with Glasgow University taken by the Glasgow photography firm of Thomas Annan. So there are other photographs, but not specifically of the Edinburgh pageant that took place, that wonderful, well, it wasn't wonderful actually, because on the day it was due to be performed on the 13th of June, the heavens opened and the rain came down. So instead of parading through the grounds, sadly, they had to perform in the concert hall. So variety, definitely, but I think it's wonderful to be able to share this spectacle with you. So thank you all very much indeed for listening to this. Thank you indeed. Thank you. I'll stop screen sharing now.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, it's so good. I love these photos, and I could go on, but I won't. But I do love the idea of Helen Paxton Brown playing the corpse, essentially. That's amazing. We're gonna roll right on into our museum 5 minutes. I've just lost my doc. What just happened? Oh no. My word crashed that had my introduction to describe who Becky is. So that's terrible. But what I can tell you about Rebecca Quinton, because I know her, something really strange has happened here for me, is that, I do have it. Well, I can tell you that Becky's the person who trained me to look at garments. I was going to publicly thank her. Anyway, I have it here. I was going to publicly thank her as part of her introduction because she is the person who taught me to make donuts and baguettes for packing dresses and how to unpack them and how to look carefully at them. And so I owe a great deal to Rebecca Quinton, who is the, are you still research manager? Are you still doing that? I thought that was going to wrap up after the Burl Open.
It was only supposed to be for 2 years. I'm now clocking 6.5.
Gosh, well, sometimes when you're made the curator of costume, you end up doing other things. So your curatorial remit is European dress and textiles, including medieval to early modern tapestries, embroideries, lace at the Brill collection. Becky's curated numerous displays and exhibitions, including A Dress to Die For, How Fashion Was Changed by Technology at the People's Palace, Century of Style, which was fantastic at the Kelvin Grove. And currently your research includes 19th century dress and textile manufacturers, legacies of slavery and empire, and Scottish wedding outfits, when you're not managing the research remit for all of Glasgow museums for 6 years. Becky, tell us more, please.
Thank you, Robin. That's a lovely introduction. Yes, don't ever be persuaded to go for an acting up post, is the lesson learned there. So yes, Glasgow Museum's traditionally called the Costume Collection, but as I head back to my substantive post, we have changed it to dress. I'm still not entirely sure how large the collection is. Curators will know the issue with digital documentation is, have we counted a dress as one dress or 3 parts of a dress in terms of our numbers? But I think we've got over 1,000 to possibly 2,000 for 19th century. Overall, the dress and textile collection is 20,000 plus. Today, for time, I'm just going to focus on the dress, not the textiles. So yes, the 2 exhibitions I focused on, one was on technology, one was on colour, which is also just an excuse to get a fantastic range out and photographed. None of the collection had been photographed before to digital standards. So this was from a Century of Style. As you'd expect, we're a local authority museum, so we are generally reliant on donations, and therefore the majority of it is women's wear, vast majority of it, but we do have some menswear, which includes sportswear, which I've classified as its own little sub-collection, outerwear, and the main survivor for 19th century menswear are waistcoats, some with local labels, this beautiful one here by a London tailor, Henry Poole. We, as many collections will have, we'll have the hatches, matches and dispatches. We have got a really nice collection of Victorians children's wear, mainly toddlers and infants, and obviously here being southwest Scotland, there is a high number of Ayrshire long gowns, short gowns and caps. So this is Ayrshire white work, which is defined by having the needle lace within the embroidery anglaise, the white work. We have women's wear, over 300 dresses from kind of 5 from the first decade to over 50 for each decade later on, which of course includes a high percentage of wedding dresses. They are what's kept in the attic for future generations to donate. During lockdown, I finally got cracking and started on the provenance research of these. Scotland, lots of the books are written about wedding dresses are based on English. In Scotland, the marriage laws are different. You could get married from home, not necessarily in a church. So there is a higher percentage of best day dresses. And we find that we are getting cream dresses coming in from the 1870s by the wealthier brides. The 2 cream dresses here, both there, in one case, Jessie on the left and Jessie in the center are from shipbuilding families. So I have a lot more. I haven't yet identified the bride on the right, but it's led to that question in terms of how many of the other surviving examples of everyday dress is actually a wedding dress. It was a best day wedding dress, and that was the reason it was kept. But through the family generations, it's just been lost as being a wedding dress. Oops. Back. We've also got morning wear. Not a huge number, but I've put this slide in as well. As part of a civic collection, it means that I can make links across the collection. So we've got a fantastically strong collection of portraits, which helps with interpretation. Our decorative art collections have got a fantastic Scottish jewellery, mourning jewellery, which is brilliant when it comes to putting them all together. Accessories, well, of course, museums have got accessories. A few early examples I've put in one of our lovely early Regency ones. A couple I've thrown in for Robin, Thomas Carlyle's hats. Who knows whether it's the one in the Whistler portrait. Again, some of these had come in. Most of ours are probably coming in from descendants of the donors. Some of our fans have come in from two smaller fan collections, one passed on from the National Museum of Antiquities, now the National Museums of Scotland, and another set of fans that was collected by somebody who was serving in the Spanish Civil War and was given a percentage of Spanish and Portuguese fans as thank yous, family heirlooms passed on as the gratitude, and ended up in Glasgow. So say a lot of our work is linked to Glasgow and surrounding southwest areas in terms of department stores, dressmakers, and this is the focus of my work at the moment, not only cataloguing the collection, but trying to create biographical records. So here, this is David Kemp, who is second shop up on Buchanan Street, later taken over, as most of them were, by House of Fraser. And as well as the tailors, the dressmakers, I'm also slowly trying to find out who the wearers were so that we can put all the dresses back into their correct social class, social background. And this is where previously I had thought we had a very middle class collection, and I'm finding out more and more of our best day dresses are actually working class. I wouldn't classify it as working dress, but it is the Sunday best for our working classes. So how can you find out more? Well, as I ease back into being a curator, I'm trying to get back to our Collections Navigator. This is our online database where we have released the records. We have released our historical documentation as well. So all the 20th century, the records are still a mess. I'm slowly working my way through the 19th century so that they have got consistent terminology. And there's a new set that I did earlier this year of collection level descriptions. And we are slowly adding what photographs we have at the moment. We're trying to get back on. This is the way into the collection, and we are reopening our appointment service this autumn. We had to close through COVID, and through the borough just took all our central services staff. So here's the screenshot to take. Here is our inquiry number and our Collections Navigator addresses if you want to find out more or get in contact with me, apart from catching me on Twitter. Kate, thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. Oh, it is such a fantastic collection for anybody. There's just a bit of everything. And I'm just an extra kudos to Becky because it's a frequent user of the Collections Navigator. It's the fashion section that's probably the best up to date. Forget the design objects, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, thank you so much. And I'm sorry that we've run over. We had a little technical glitch at the start, but I hope people are able to stick around for some more questions. I'm very happy to stay if our speakers are. I'll hand it over to Anna if you want to catch us up on some of the questions that have come in.
Yeah, how far back should we go, Robin? Because
shall we start with some questions for Liz, and if there's anything for Becky, and then if we can go back a bit more generally if there's some time and people still want to engage.
Okay, so so comments. Veronica made the comment for Elizabeth that there is a familiar look with Henry Irving as Faust, so sort of thinking about the crossovers there. And Robin came in with, well, they probably saw that. And then Veronica's put in a link to Henry Irving as Mephistopheles in Faust. Mm-hmm. And sorry, I'm a bit frazzled today. I'm a bit fried. I've been on the beach too much. I'm on holiday at the moment, and I'm a little malfunctional. So Veronica's question was, she would be fascinated to know how they paid for these costumes. I mean, this is a huge pageant, incredibly lavish, 1,000 players, significant investment in research materials and making. How?
Yes. Thank you. I can't get my image going, but I think you can hear me all right anyway, which is the main thing. Yes, over 1,000 players. Well, and it was all organized in practical terms in less than 6 months. There were working groups, some of them in children's shelters or children's homes. Women went there to make the costume, but fortunately we know who supplied some of the materials. We know that the materials came from 3 main suppliers: Jenner's department store in Edinburgh, malls, which later became Binns and later House of Fraser at the west end of Princes Street. And the third provider of costume fabrics was Cranston and Elliott. And we know that different theatrical companies became involved. There was the Edinburgh Theatrical Supply Company in Union Street in Edinburgh, and also the Lyceum Theatre, Howard and Wyndham at the Lyceum Theatre. So they were providing some costumes they were making up, but basically they were made by, well, a variety of different types of makers. There would be dressmakers who were taken on specifically to make them. There were amateur seamstresses and professional seamstresses who were working in the children's hospitals, children's schools, and shelters. And there is also among the archives that I've been looking at, thanks to Liz Lewis, who is with us today. She's part of the team here this afternoon. She is curator at the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. And Liz very kindly put me onto the archives at National Records Scotland, which I looked at last Monday. And there is a directory there of various names of the great and the good who subscribed money to help finance all this. We know that there were members of the aristocracy, the gentry, and the middle classes were pouring money into the making. So they would be paying the theatre companies, they would be buying the fabrics, but much of the actual making, I suspect, was done for absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Professional seamstresses and dressmakers would be paid, of course, to do it, and they would be paid by the people who were stumping up the money. But I think much of it was amateur making, amateur without any payment at all.
Thank you. That answers. There have been a couple of questions on who actually put these extraordinary things together. I mean, why was 1908 such a bumper year, as it were? You know, what was the overriding remit for such a big one?
Well, I think it followed the idea of the two Queen Mary pageants organised by the Waltons the previous 2 years. Also, the national exhibition planned for Sauchiton Park, which did happen, which is where the pageant did take place, but not through the grounds on the day. They had proposed in late 1907 that there should be a series of pageants, small-scale pageants, to bring some of Scotland's history to life. And then there was the agreement eventually, and this only happened in the spring of 1908, that the pageant should switch to being performed during and at the exhibition rather than in the grounds of Donaldson's Hospital for the Deaf. So I think it was a combination of different things. They were aware of the whole pageant culture happening south of the border, if you like. And there had also been, there were all kinds of mini pageants taking place all over Scotland before 1908. For instance, in 1907, we read in newspaper reports of a fancy dress cycle parade happening in the little East Lothian town of North Berwick. And you imagine, unfortunately, we don't have any visual records of that, but you can imagine cyclists whizzing along dressed as Mary Queen of Scots and Queen Elizabeth as well. It wasn't only Scottish characters. So dressing up was certainly part of the culture in Scotland already in the 1900s. So I think it was a combination of different factors coming into play.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And was it well received by the press? I mean, was it sort of seen as a celebration of Scottish culture? And
oh yes, great tub thumping, I think, here. SNP, now as the Scottish National Party, has the same initials as the Scottish National Pageant. Do you think that as well? That's been proceeded on. Well, certainly it was part of the romantic nationalist movement, romantic nationalism, quite definitely. Celtic revival was already well underway in terms of design and art as well. I mean, John Duncan doesn't suddenly become an artist in 1908. He's producing all kinds of such paintings before which link in and Jessie King as well. And the Glasgow style can be seen as staunchly Celtic.
Yeah. Could I just chime in, because it occurred to me while you were showing it about the E.A. Walton and his time in London and Chelsea. He actually was in London at the same time as the Healthy and Artistic Dress Union pageants, the
Yes.
living pictures. So not only am I sure that he went, I think you and I need to sit down with those photographs and see if he was maybe in it.
Yes, right. Well, come and visit when you like.
I will. The cast. I'm convinced that they were in the cast. So that was fantastic. Did we have any for Becky? Do we have a question for Becky?
Yes, we do. So, well, I've kicked off with what a wonderful collection of dress. Rebecca, do you have a personal favourite? Is the one that shouts out to you?
It's tricky. No, as a parent, you kind of feel you shouldn't have favourites. And I do tend to be that kind of, the favourite is whichever period I'm currently working on, there'll be a top-notch one in there. I know in terms of people's favourite, because the Lord Provost asked for a copy for dressing up in a pageant, and whenever it goes on Twitter, it always has so many likes, and it was the blue going away outfit I showed on the last dress slide that was made for the daughter of a stockbroker here in Glasgow.
There's lots of comments, amazing photos, what amazing work you're doing, putting it all together and making it available. And the garment and the photograph of it being worn side by side was just wonderful to see. I think everybody agrees on that.
Yes, no, there aren't that many. That was a copy photograph that came in. I'm hoping that by publishing more of the wearers' details, that it'll be picked up by people doing their own family history research, and they might get in contact and say, oh, actually, I didn't realise my cousin had donated Granny's dress. Here's a photo of her wearing it or wearing something similar.
It's the dream, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Our mission is to connect the objects with people and places. So I feel that sort of part of my work really pays off.
I think one of the key things that's come out today too is about well, we all know the power of collecting, and but equally that, you know, the album that Elizabeth has been so fortunate, this is her album that she's working on, and Kate knows how wonderful this is when you can find that thing and then own it and dig on it, and obviously, and then these things come into museum collections. So I think that's really exciting. I think it'd be really interesting to talk more about that, like who has amazing finds in their own little personal collection that they've been able to work on, because that's a huge privilege. I don't really have a question about that. I was just thinking about that, like how lucky you guys are to have these things that you find and you work on, or even have you know, care of, like Becky and Emily, obviously your babies, as you've just said. So that's been fantastic. Does anyone have any, anyone have any comments or questions? I'm mindful of how long we're running over, but I also don't want to cut anyone off. If you have something a burning question or something you'd like to chime in on, this has been absolutely fascinating. Okay. Well, with that, then I think we probably should wind this up. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around as we've run a bit over. But thank you especially to our amazing speakers today, Emily Taylor, Benjamin Wild, Elizabeth Cumming, and Rebecca Quinton. I'm trying to do your proper names since so many of you am Liz, Becky. Thank you so much for being here today. These were fascinating talks. I think we could go on and on, obviously, about these topics. I know I certainly could, and I hope we can actually have this as maybe a springboard for further conversations, because there's some questions about costume and fashion and their relationships and their complexities, particularly in the 19th century. I think Ben said it very well. about how murky these things get. I know lots of us in 19th century dress and textiles committee are fascinated by that. Kim, I'm glancing at you. This is part of what we've talked about for a long time. So hopefully we can carry this conversation on. So thank you so much for coming. Our next, I was terrible and I didn't get our next talk information up. Is there anyone here who can chime in on that? Veronica or Hannah? I can't remember.
Hannah and Kate are leading on it, but I can say if they don't want to. Kate or Hannah, do you want to go, or shall I say? It's
I'm happy to talk about it quickly.
Yes,
just very quickly. It'll be on Sunday, the 21st of August. So we've moved it a week earlier than normal. So Sunday, the 21st of August, and we are aiming to do a session on menswear. That's the theme at the moment. So speakers, we are in talks with a few people, but we think it will be a very good session. So looking forward to seeing everyone there.
We'll get that information up as soon as we can and get it out to you via the usual channels. And if you don't know what the usual channels are, pop me a message. We have our group, our email group that we have out there. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, and you'll get a follow-up email even with your registration. Thank you for coming, with the information of how to connect with us if you're not already connected. But I'm assuming you're mostly already connected because you're here. So with that, thank you so much for coming on what's turned out here in Scotland to start to be a sunny afternoon, though it wasn't when we started, but that's Scotland for you. And I hope to see you guys again at our next event. Thank you so much for coming. And we can do the absence of sounds. Yay, you're getting some emote claps. What wonderful. Thank you guys for doing your reactions. Yay, thanks so much. Oh, pageants. We're going to do a pageant, aren't we? Is that part of our 19th century dress and textiles? We're going to.
Of course. Why not?
We did. Hillary, some of you guys were there. Hillary, we talked about we want to do like a sew along and make like reform dress or whatever. Or what does she call it? A wafting dress. We need to pick our favorite moment in the 19th century and make a wafting dress that we all.
Yeah, but we won't be able to agree on our favorite moments. That's the thing.
Well, that's it. We each can do our own. We're going to represent our favorite version of a wafting dress, as she called it.
Well, I think I'm going to take inspiration from the pageants and employ a specialist maker to create mine. So, yeah.
I'm just going to be straight in gingham.
Gingham?
Yeah, perfect.
Always I have gingham. Some gingham in the closet. No, I don't. It's seersucker. I'm lying. I have seersucker in the closet.
As my passing present to you, especially you, Robin, next year we'll be mounting and photographing Jessie Newby's wedding dress.
Yay!
You recall is based on the Carpaccio, St. Ursula. So is that a fancy dress if it's the wedding dress?
Oh, controversial.
Yeah, it's occasion wear. I got. Yeah, that's a good one. I know everyone's very excited that the Burl is open and you're open, because I think that we've said a few times of when we can come. When can people? Everyone's like, when can we come up and go to the Burl? So
Burl is open. There's one gallery still to open, and there's a big temporary exhibition going further into Sir William Burrell and his wife Constance's collecting and putting together the Burrell collection. That opens later in August. But yeah.
It's great. I went finally a couple weeks ago.
It's busy, but not so busy in terms of feeling safe with the current pandemic.
That's good to know.
Go and enjoy the Highland cows as you walk through the park.
I actually thought I might go sit and work in there because all the great seating, all the good.
It's the only building at the moment that's actually got decent Wi-Fi, decent IT full stop, and that includes a good public Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go sit and work in there a little bit.
Perfect.